Merry Christmas, everyone. I have something exceptionally exciting for you today as part of the Christmas special edition of the Venomous Classic series. Every Christmas, I pick out a special game, one that I really sort of keep on the back burner, and I want to save it for Christmas because it's so good. And this is one of those games. This is WhiteRaw vs. IdrA. This is from WCG 2009 Worlds. And I am very sick. I contracted pneumonia about 11 days ago, and it's been very bad, severe enough where I missed work, and my breathing capacity has been severely limited and still is, so I'm going to sound a little bit off in this video, but every year on this channel I do a Christmas special, and it's really important to me that I get this video out, so it sounds like Babe Ruth delivering his final speech at Yankee Stadium, but there's the macro machine right there, Greg IdrA Fields. And again, this is from '09, so the recording is going to be a little low quality, but not terrible. We'll certainly be able to tell what's going on. So if you're unfamiliar with WCG, this was all there was in terms of foreigner StarCraft tournaments back in the Brood War days before Star 2 came out in 2010. This is a nationalistic tournament where there would be regional qualifiers from countries all over the world, and the two best players would get to go represent their country at a world tournament. So this year, IdrA destroyed WCG America. This was IdrA at the peak of his powers. This was when IdrA was over in Korea and was very well practiced and sharp. WCG 2008 was a disaster for IdrA because he had a ton of hype around him, and he was expected to do very well because he had joined a Korean team. However, he had to face off against G5, the Terran vs. Protoss sniper, and his Media Clan teammate on Protoss-favored maps like Andromeda, and lost. And unfortunately, that was a huge low point in Greg's career because he had an incredible amount of hype, and he had a team his Korean team representative, sort of like the guy that spoke English, that was like the liaison between Istro, I guess, at the time. And IdrA lost like a really crushing match against a foreigner. And there's a foreigner right there, also a Protoss player, also known for his Terran vs. Protoss play. That's WhiteRaw. WhiteRaw is a guy who invented a tactic called Special Tactics, which, if you're familiar with Artosis complaining about Gateway Man, WhiteRaw's the one who invented that. And as Jeff and Control Robinson once quipped, turns out Special Tactics is like 13 Gate Zealot Dragoon bust, which like it is. The idea behind Gateway Man or Special Tactics is WhiteRaw, the incredibly gregarious Ukrainian player, calls it. Special Tactics is when like you don't tech up, you fast expand and oftentimes take a rapid third base to get your economy going. Then you make a plethora of gateways, sometimes even neglecting a forge, but you always get charge, and of course Dragoon range, just like every match. And then you overwhelm the Terran, because if we think about how this matchup is played, the Terran is always trying to make a bunch of Vulture tank and tech up into that steady mech backbone and take a third. Protoss has the ability to ruthlessly torment Terran. They have all the little tools in the playbook imaginable. They can do so many obnoxious things. Think about while Terran is trying to get siege mode, get their first couple tanks out. In that little time frame, Protoss can do like proxy gate aggression before the factory gets up, gas jack, DT drop, proxy gate DT, fast arbiter recall, reaver bust, proxy reaver bust. And with a lot of these builds, you can throw in the word proxy and it can hit 30 seconds sooner and be even sharper and more abusive. Another thing that's worth considering about this is that Protoss has all of those options to be aggressive, but they also have the ability to macro. That's what makes Protoss so hard to play against. Love that CJ IdrA media tag, by the way, one of the best IDs in gaming history. WhiteRaw there, the incredibly talented Ukrainian, is spawning on the left side of Tau Cross, a balanced 3-player map that was one of my favorites ever and was one of the first maps that I ever played in Brood War. This was one of the first Brood War matches I ever watched. Of course, I started out with StarCraft 2, like many of us in the early Wings of Liberty days. but I had to sort of go back and rediscover Brood War and like figure it out after the fact. And it's very interesting to consider that this happens to a lot of people, where we start with StarCraft 2. For a lot of us, StarCraft 2 was like one of our first RTSs, or really our first RTS. So whenever I think about things like this, I just have to consider that, okay, a lot of you really aren't as familiar with the Brood War metagame as the StarCraft 2 metagame. And I think Terran vs. Protoss in this, which is what we're watching, is the most exciting matchup because it has the best dynamics between the races. Protoss has the ability to do so much and really be in the driver's seat. When we think about Protoss, it's the tempo setting race, both in Star 1 and Star 2. As we see Nick and Dan there, who originally commentated this game. The audio for this game, by the way, is not very good. And I pretty much don't ever re-commentate anything Tasteless and Artosis did, unless it's over a decade old. And of course, this is a very special game that was sort of on the Venomous Classic Christmas special, holy crap, it's so good list. There was another video that I wanted to do for this year's Christmas special that I'd actually been thinking about for months, but it's like a 45-minute long macro game. I'm going to cast that one when I'm healthy. IdrA there, looking around the map thinking, okay, I'm playing WhiteRaw. WhiteRaw was a talented macro player, but he was also known as a guy famous for his special tactics build, where he would rapidly expand and then try to crush you with like mass Zealot Dragoon out of like 11 gateways. Remember, there's no multiple building select in StarCraft Brood War. You have to click each building to make a unit. So if you're doing like an 11 gate all in StarCraft 2, you hit W, you hold S, and you click a bunch to make like a big Stalker Workben. In Brood War, you like camera hotkey back to your base, click a gate, hit Z, click a gate, hit Z, click, you get the point. Like, it's much harder to macro. And remember, there's no multiple building select, so that means that whenever you have to change your rally point, you have to do it for each building, which is like absurdly annoying. Speaking of absurdly annoying, the first probe is out here for WhiteRaw. It'll be chased away by the Marine. The choke here on Tau Cross between the main and the natural is really narrow. I remember one time, like, in Brood War, it's way harder to tell, like, how thick buildings are, like, how walls work. StarCraft 2, it's very easy. Like, the hexes are very consistent. You can turn the little pixel grid on, as you see Damaga there on the left, and another incredibly talented Ukrainian player. Damaga, of course, a macro Zerg and one of the most powerful players at the beginning of StarCraft 2, 2010. Because remember, this game was played in 09. IdrA had a rough WCG in 08 in America. He had a killer WCG in 09. He was solidly at the peak of his powers. IdrA would maintain peak powers a year into Wings of Liberty and would still be very good, like, through the rest of Wings of Liberty. But he was a legitimate top-end player that could punch with the Koreans at this time, in terms of as close as it would get for a foreigner. In StarCraft 2, he was winning the tournaments and making deep GSL runs and was feared by everyone. Make no mistake, at this WCG, everyone knew like a Korean was going to win it. Yes, Koreans dominate StarCraft 2, but they dominated Brood War even harder. Brood War is a more mechanically difficult game, as you see WhiteRaw starting to pressure the bunker, and we just get a crowd shot there for no reason. Absolute nonsense there to go to a crowd shot whenever the goons come up. The goons are marauding around the front door of WhiteRaw. IdrA desperately trying to see, okay, does he have a base? And I love the little sort of deceitful exchange that occurred there. WhiteRaw wants to expand off of this 2-gate range goon pressure. Notice he hid the probe on the very north where IdrA couldn't see it. So IdrA ran in, saw that there was no expansion, and was like, it's WhiteRaw, like, is there a robo somewhere? Is he making a citadel about right? Is he going to go DT? But look at this. After feigning that he was going to all in, WhiteRaw cut units and double expanded. This is brilliant play. And this is why Brood War is like the best game ever made and is truly brilliant. Because that tiny little amount of information exchange, which was an intentional deception by the Protoss player, is going to have a cascading effect on how IdrA plays. And WhiteRaw is playing off his reputation. He's also playing off of IdrA's reputation as a robo started here for the Ukrainian Terror. And WhiteRaw knows Greg IdrA Fields is a methodical macro player at the peak of his powers. This is a guy who is training out in Korea and is probably the best foreigner player at the moment. And Dan Artosis in this era called him the foreigner Bonjour and said that he had the highest win rate against non-Koreans out of any other non-Korean player. So WhiteRaw knows, okay, I need to take extra risks this game. I don't want to go 2-gate Robo Expand Observer into a safe third. I'm going to pretend like I'm cheesing and go double expand. That's part of what makes StarCraft so beautiful, is the ability to give away information, whether it be true or false, and then play off of your reputation as an armory starts up for the macro machine and an observatory for the Ukrainian Terror. And as my voice fades rapidly, like Matt Harvey in Game 5 of the 2015 World Series, I'd like to remind all of you to leave a like on the video, subscribe, hit the bell notification, favorite and share the video if you have any friends that watch StarCraft or used to watch StarCraft. Send the vid their way. Another gate here for the Ukrainian Terror. And frequently when WhiteRaw would go for this gateway man special tactics style, he would get observers and maybe a shuttle to do zealot bombs, but in terms of other tech, that was it. He would not get Reaver, not get Arbiter, and certainly not tech up into Storm. And oftentimes wouldn't even really make DT. It's like, okay, mass zealot Dragoon, and then I'm going to get legs. Notice that WhiteRaw has a plethora of workers, and he has not taken his gases. Citadel there. And it's looking like special tactics here. The third base here on Tau Cross is a bit weird. It's directly south of the natural, and there was a kooky little high ground that you could like drop tanks on. And I would hilariously see IdrA do this sometimes. And it was always funny to see IdrA do like weird little map specific cheeses, because this was a guy who I watched play thousands of games of macro Zerg and have to like stubbornly like throw Roach Hydra Corruptor armies into force field. Wings of Liberty Zerg had pretty much no abusable terrain. I mean, I remember Dan Artosis had this joke strat whenever he played Zerg back in the beta, and this is not a joke. On Kulos Ravine, which was one of like the worst maps for Zerg ever, as IdrA scouts that bot base and sees nothing is there. That's a mineral only, that's really good for a toss. But it was so funny as that the factories get started and tanks come out. Notice that IdrA has a plethora of tanks at the front door that will make it easier to defend. What I was saying earlier is like we never got to see IdrA do any sort of cutesy map-specific tactics as Zerg, but Dan Artosis' Kulos Ravine build order, as I know probably 10 out of 10 people playing this video couldn't pick Kulos Ravine out of a lineup. This was like an absolute joke map that was so imbalanced it didn't even make it out of the first few months of Wings. But Dan Artosis would get Neural Parasite for Infestors, walk them to the high ground of Kulos Ravine Gold Base, like the high ground above the gold, and Neural Parasite the Terran's mules off the fucking mineral line. Because it was like mules on the gold. Why he didn't just fungal the whole mineral line, I'll never know, but like, I remember Artosis also had another build order for Desert Oasis, which was like another horseshit map that was terrible for Zerg. He would go one base Muta, kill like 5 Mutas. As IdrA runs in the vaults here, does a little damage, but more importantly gets scouting info. He sees Mass Gateway, and he sees a plethora of pylons and a lot of probes. He's sort of sitting there and deducing that this is Gateway Man. I got a cough, hold on. A plethora of dragoons are containing the Kraken here, and this was this weird dichotomy where Protoss could take their third super easy and it was hard to punish them, but if you were Terran it would be very difficult to wheel out and take your third. And if you ever watch Artosis' stream, this is a huge point of contention, because like the newbie player who doesn't play Brood War thinks it's so easy to take a third, and we see screaming down upon the Kraken is the Ukrainian Terror, speed zealots crashing into tanks, trying to sponge in to the mines, and IdrA saying, okay, I have plenty of tanks, I have SimCity, I have turrets, but he's getting up into my natural, it's a little scary. WhiteRaw showing off his special tactics, and he's going to retreat because of course you do not want to fight with pure goon, you have to have zealots. And the Ukrainian Terror is going to go back to his base and make more zealots. Notice that IdrA lost about half of his tanks and most of his vultures. Alexei saves the Observer, and he sees that the CC is done for IdrA. So IdrA very clearly is like trying to move out, trying to take that third, which is just south of where they're fighting. They're fighting south of the natural. South of where they're fighting is the third base. One of the things that makes Brood War really hard to learn is like how dark the fog of war is. It's not like StarCraft 2 where it's like translucent. So another wave of special tactics Zealot Dragoon is going to come in and a big explosion occurs. IdrA retreating back to his natural, being hammered here by the Ukrainian Terror as another explosion occurs as tanks get eviscerated. And again, IdrA being pushed to his limits, unable to take a third. But remember, there's no fourth here for WhiteRaw. WhiteRaw doesn't have bottom left, he doesn't have bottom middle, and he hasn't even taken the gas at 12 o'clock. Remember, in StarCraft, whenever you go for a cheese or an all-in or like a big play, a big polarizing play, you have to give something up. In other words, like WhiteRaw's going for special tactics, like 11 gate Zealot Dragoon. He had to like forego taking he delayed his gases to do that. He delayed his tech to do that. He delayed his fourth base to do that. It's like if I do a DT rush, if I rush up to DT against Terran, I'm going to skip Observer. Like I'm not going to be able to get Robo and Observatory if I'm doing like a proxy gate DT rush. Because remember, in StarCraft, like what you spend your initial little bursts of gas on really matters. In this game, we saw WhiteRaw open for goon range, and this enabled him to pressure IdrA and sort of feign like he was cheesing. And then he really only mined gas out of one geyser for the next 10 minutes, which is highly abnormal. So IdrA is trying to move around the map with vaults, and this is something very common in the matchup where it can feel like you're stuck in your base as Terran and you're really contained, but you have to make an effort to get it on the map and make sure that Protoss doesn't run wild. Protoss plays the Zerg role in this matchup in many ways. They want to mass expand. They want to put Terran in a position where they're stuck on their side of the map, and then Terran is just stuck there while they take all the bases on the map. So as Terran, this is what you have to do. You have to sneak out with vaults. You have to lay mines in the retreat path. You have to lay mines on the bridges. And you've got to scout around the bases. That's what IdrA's really doing, other than killing units that are in the rally, which is very good, and putting mines in the rally, which is very good. You're really looking for bases here. You're really worried if you're Terran about, does he have the other main? Does he have 6 o'clock? Does he have the 6 o'clock natural? But IdrA's running up here and seeing, oh, this guy doesn't even have his gas. Like, he's very hard committing to this. This is special tactics. This is, 13 gate Zealot Dragoon. This is something that is not only known about, but the media clan would joke about in Control, the late great Jeff Robinson, who everybody liked. And rest in peace to Jeff and shout out to his family. Whenever these holidays occur and I talk about In Control, I always think about like, man, it's brutal that his family doesn't have that great presence on the holidays. This is the little back path that I was talking about, but he's not going to do it. This might be Storm or Zealot drop, I'm not sure. But look at this, the Ukrainian Terror dropping Zealots on top of the tanks from the north and then hammering in from the south. IdrA cannot lose this base. He could lose this game if he loses this base. He's frogging the tanks down, leapfrogging them down, mass repairing that base, but WhiteRaw doesn't really have many Zealots left left as a big explosion occurs. The macro machine repairing that CC, it's about at 60% health like me IRL, and the macro machine is moving this monolith ridge of tanks down. Notice he didn't want to unsiege everything because then a bunch of zealots would have ran in as the goons start to get juiced and IdrA can return to mining. But that base, relatively hard to take when you consider how wide open that third was where whiteRA was attacking initially. And then not only is there a little abusive area where you can drop stuff behind the third, there's a bridge. But one thing that I was saying earlier about watching IdrA's play is like, it's funny watching him play Terran if you've like started watching him play like 5,000 Zerg games and never get to like abuse terrain or do like any tactical play at all. I mean, think about the maps they were playing on in the early days of Wings of Liberty, like Steppes of War, the aforementioned Kulos Ravine, Zelnaga Caverns. I mean, Metalopolis was like the best map in the pool, guys, and you could spawn in close, and there were no neutral depots. Arbiter Tribunal on the way here. Notice that after the Gateway Man aggression like clearly has sort of stalled, after IdrA's siege tank backbone has been established, whiteRA is going to sit there to himself and say, okay, like the jig is up, I've got to tech up, I can't just sit here and keep throwing gateway units over at him, and IdrA kills that probe. Notice that whiteRA was trying to bring a probe down to expand. That's really annoying. If you see that your Protoss opponent is like running a probe out to a base and they have an army with it, the probe has so little health where like you can burst it down a lot of times, and it's such a pain in the ass to go get another one. A lot of times Protoss players have their builds timed out in terms of like, think about in StarCraft 2 like a normal macro game, PvZ, like the TOS wants to take their third like right on that little number that they have in their head. Obviously a messy land game from 09 isn't like that, where like that fourth base timing isn't quote unquote standard. You know, that's a fourth base timing that occurred after sort of like a big all-in. Brood War is so beautiful, guys. Like, whiteRA not only was deceitful in the early game and played off of his reputation and his opponent's rep, but we got to see a great little back and forth unfold as an excellent storm occurs, killing some spider mines, and we can see why turrets are made. They prevent shuttles and observers from running wild. IdrA fanning out all over this bridge, and here's the Ukrainian Terror screaming north down on the bridge, but this is the macro machine. He has a plethora of tanks, and he's trying to move down and take a fourth, and it's just an incredible amount of terrain to cover. whiteRA desperately trying to kill this fourth, just like he was desperately trying to kill the third, and IdrA again swinging southbound, doing everything he can to try to repair, running SCVs down to the edge of the lake like it's the end of the Prisoner of Azkaban to repair that Ma. We see whiteRA has that base, but no probes down there yet. He needs to do a transfer. 3 Stargates out, and presumably Arbiter is about to get started since the Tribunal finished. And we see the goons hammering the Graken here. IdrA really wants to take that bot right base, not the main, but the pocket. And here the Graken is starting to juice some goons like crazy. And this is what happens whenever you don't have zealots. And I think whiteRA ran into a little bit of a power trough in the sense that he didn't have fourth base economy going. And he also didn't have tech units. Remember earlier what I said about trading things off? If you go for Gateway Man, you give up other stuff. Well, he delayed gases 2 and 3. He delayed the fourth. So when the macro machine was able to hold, and remember, IdrA made his third in his base intelligently, like in his main. So whenever whiteRA's aggression failed, IdrA was able to just float the base out, set his tanks up, and then transfer workers, which was obviously the right thing to do in the correct macro play. And that's as opposed to, oh, crap, okay, well, he has a big army out here, so I'm not going to be able to start my third until I get control. You know, IdrA started his third before the all-in really even hit him fully. So once he was able to hold it minutes later and get a little bit of map control, the third was already done, he could float it out. That's why they call him the macro machine, folks. whiteRA continuing to expand bot left, but there's this moment whenever you play this matchup, which I think is the best matchup in any game. there's this moment where if you're Protoss, where like the Terran gets their 2-1, they get their upgrades, they have a plethora of tanks, they have like a whole control group of tanks, they have like 15 volts, they have their upgrades, they have speed, they have mines, and they do their first big push, and it's like, oh my gosh. And remember, in this matchup, Protoss is playing the Zerg role in the sense that they want to have more expansions and more supply. The supply is about even. As Arbiters are out here, remember, everything below the Arbiter is invisible, as more Zealot bombs are attempting to be used to circumvent this nasty bridge work from the Kraken. And the goons continue to hammer down upon Greg, who loses his vessel, which of course is a detector, and one of the main ways you deal with Arbiters. And White Raw is between a rock and a hard place. He's sort of stalling out here. He lost one of his bases. IdrA is retreating and defending. And again, White Raw stalls out, attacking the third and the fourth. More units here for the Ukrainian Terror, though. He's running up in the natural of the Kraken, as this has been an incredibly scrappy game. As IdrA loses another tank, note that IdrA has turrets everywhere. This is how you want to do it if you're a macro Terran. Spam them turrets. As his natural mines out, he starts to place some mines. One of the ways that you can lose as Terran, even if you're ahead, is if your opponent camps your production. If your opponent is sitting on top of your production as Terran, this is one of the things that can just be damning. And this is part of what makes Recall so strong. Recall really allows Protoss to just, surprise, I'm on all your production. And if you're out on the map, you can just be screwed. As White Raw's sort of looking around and realizing that he's running out of options. That bottom left base, the 9 o'clock died. And that's worth noting because the base that is sort of 8 o'clock also died. So White Raw is essentially not mining. It's essentially mined out of 12 o'clock, his natural third, which we see right there. And then his natural is also sort of mined out. So you run into this spot where you're Protoss and you have the expansion advantage and you have the ability, as the High Templar gets picked off there, you have the ability to sort of like set the tempo. But once Terran wrestles tempo back from you, and you are unable to really mine, as IdrA sees these probes transferring, this is huge. This is literally White Raw's entire economy, as this base is not even done yet, as about 30 workers get transferred. And the macro machine scouting that is going to be a game-defining thing. If that base had been allowed to get up, if those probes had been allowed to mine, that's, step one in White Raw coming back in the game. But as it stands, IdrA knows, okay, that base is down there, and he's pretty much hell-bent on defending that, so he's just going to bring the hammer down on the Ukrainian Terror. And note that IdrA has good upgrades, and even Arbiter spam is going to be a thing that is not really going to be enough when it comes to dealing with this much Terran, as White Raw just does not really have much supply at all. The American macro machine gets a plethora of tanks sieged up, but they of course do get stasis. White Raw screaming eastbound, and it feels like I've been screaming at a Motley Crue concert for 4 straight hours. Feel like fucking Vince Neil after a long day of drinking. Jesus Christ. Ugh. White Raw continuing to aggress and hammering away at these tanks, and I've got to drop like one hilarious like god tier piece of trivia. Before this match, White Raw said, if I beat IdrA, I will propose to my girlfriend. And like of course IdrA won, and like White Raw didn't propose, but the guy bet proposal on this series. It was a WCG versus IdrA, and like he ended up losing to IdrA, which is just sort of funny. Like you hear all these stories about like, oh yeah, like if I knew like I was gonna win and then propose, like White Raw had that thought, and then like he ran into the macro machine. The Kraken had his way with him. As at this point, there's just not much left for toss. White Raw, one of the most beloved and gregarious players in the entire scene. Look at Fedora guy there on the left. So if you're wondering like how the rest of this tournament went, this was group stage, this WCG groups. Well, IdrA won his group. He went 6-1, and then he had to play like some German he didn't respect in the round of 8, and like he got cheesed twice, as White Rock calls GG there. So the American Macro Machine wins that. Merry Christmas. And then like after IdrA got cheesed and lost, what happened is that German went on to play Stork, who of course like IdrA was friendly rivals with and really respected and had classics with. And there was another match that I'm going to talk about in the future where IdrA almost played Flash on an MLG main stage, and that's something that really no one has ever talked about or knows because it happened in the pit of an MLG Dallas, and I was standing 3 feet behind him. So I'm probably going to cover that next. Big ups to you guys. That might literally be in 3 weeks. I'm going to the doctor in a couple days, but I've got more fucking fluid in my lungs than the Atlantic, so sub for more, guys. Stay easy. Merry Christmas. Type easy. Easy.